The galaxy had seen its share of brutality, but nothing like this. The broadcast began without warning, hijacking every known interstellar network. No encryption, no delay, just raw, unfiltered horror spilling across the void. 50,000 women, bound and forced to their knees in a vast execution yard, their eyes filled with terror. Overhead, the crimson banners of the Galactic Empire fluttered, casting long shadows over their trembling forms. At the center of it all stood Grand Marshal Varen, his obsidian armor gleaming under the cold artificial lights. His voice, amplified across systems, carried the weight of absolute authority. "This," he declared, sweeping his hand over the kneeling prisoners, "is the cost of defiance." A wave of silence followed, thick with disbelief. Across human space, on Earth, on Mars, on distant colony worlds, people froze, unable to look away. News stations scrambled to verify the feed, but the truth was undeniable. The Empire had done it. A mass execution carried out in full view of the universe, not as a strategic necessity but as a lesson. The women had been taken from Kasara 4, a struggling human colony at the Empire's fringes. It had never been a military threat, merely a settlement fighting to survive in the shadow of an empire that saw humans as little more than a nuisance. They had refused to comply with new imperial decrees, taxes too high to sustain, labor demands that would have stripped them of their dignity. The rebellion had been bloodless, a protest rather than an uprising. But the Empire did not tolerate defiance, no matter how small. As Varen gave the order, the women's screams were swallowed by the thunder of plasma fire. Line by line they collapsed. Mothers, daughters, sisters, falling into the dirt as smoke curled into the air. The camera lingered, capturing every second of their agony. The last thing the galaxy saw before the feed cut was Varen's cold, satisfied smirk. On Earth, in the heart of the United Nations Interstellar Council, silence reigned. The chamber, built for diplomacy, now felt suffocating under the weight of what had just been witnessed. Some delegates sat frozen, unable to process the scale of the atrocity. Others whispered in hushed, horrified tones. But Elias Carter, Earth's senior diplomat, only stared at the blank screen, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. He had spent decades navigating the fragile balance of interstellar politics, bargaining, compromising, doing whatever was necessary to ensure humanity's survival. He had seen wars, betrayals, the quiet cruelty of those who wielded power without conscience. But this was something else. This was extermination made spectacle, a calculated act of terror meant to break the human spirit. A deep, simmering rage coiled in his gut, but he forced it down. Emotion would accomplish nothing right now. Strategy, precision, that was how justice would be served. The president of Earth's United Council, a woman hardened by years of negotiation with hostile powers, finally spoke. "We cannot let this stand." Her words, though steady, carried an edge of uncertainty. She knew as well as Carter did that humanity, for all its progress, was still outmatched. The Galactic Empire had fleets that dwarfed theirs, armies bred for conquest. Retaliation through war would be suicide. Another delegate, a colonel from the Interstellar Defense Corps, spoke with barely contained fury. "Then what do you propose? A strongly worded condemnation? Sanctions? They just slaughtered 50,000 civilians on live broadcast. The Empire doesn't care about words." Carter exhaled slowly. The room was teetering on the edge of chaos, torn between grief and the need for immediate action. He had to be the anchor. "They want us to react with blind rage," he said finally, his voice cutting through the noise. "They want us to lash out, to give them the justification to wipe out more of us. We won't play their game." The colonel narrowed his eyes. "Then what do we do, Ambassador? Sit back and grieve?" Carter turned to the screen where the broadcast had played, his mind already weaving possibilities, searching for the right thread to pull. War wasn't an option, but that didn't mean there was no path to justice. The Empire had just made a mistake, a monumental one. "They wanted the galaxy to see this," Carter murmured. "Fine. We'll make sure they do." The full weight of his plan hadn't formed yet, but the foundation was clear. The Empire relied on fear, on the assumption that no one would dare challenge them. But if humanity could expose their brutality in a way that even the most neutral species couldn't ignore, if they could fracture the illusion of the Empire's invincibility, "We make them answer for this," he said, this time with unshakable resolve. "Not with weapons. Not yet. But with something far more dangerous to tyrants: truth." The room fell into a tense silence. Some looked unconvinced. Others, like the president, studied him with measured curiosity. Outside, across Earth and its colonies, The first wave of grief was already turning to something else. The broadcast had not just delivered terror, it had ignited a fire. For the first time in history, humanity stood united in a singular demand: justice. The Galactic Council chamber was a masterpiece of alien architecture, a vast dome suspended in the void, its walls shifting with iridescent patterns that pulsed like a living organism. Delegates from 100 species occupied their designated spheres, their forms, some humanoid, others utterly alien, hovering in perfect silence. At the heart of the chamber, beneath the blinding white light of the tribunal, stood Elias Carter. He had been here before. He knew the rituals, the weight of unspoken rules, the delicate balance of power. But never had he stood before them like this. Alone, humanity's sole voice against an empire that had just slaughtered 50,000 of his own. Across from him, seated upon a high obsidian throne, was Chancellor Nethros, the empire's chief diplomat. Unlike the brutish Grand Marshal Varen, Nethros was a creature of refinement, his violet-hued skin smooth and unlined, his eyes glacial and devoid of empathy. His posture was relaxed, as if the events of Kasara IV were little more than an administrative inconvenience. Carter stepped forward. His movements were deliberate, controlled. No hesitation, no anger, only the weight of undeniable truth. 50,000 unarmed civilians, he said, his voice steady but carrying through the vast chamber. 50,000 women, executed on live broadcast. A crime of unimaginable scale, committed in defiance of every principle this council was founded upon. Nethros tilted his head slightly, considering him with faint amusement. Crime? He echoed. Ambassador Carter, you misunderstand. It was not a crime. It was a necessary action. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some species, those long accustomed to imperial brutality, remained silent. Others, the more neutral factions, shifted uneasily. Carter knew he had to force them to see, truly see what had happened. There was no rebellion, he pressed. No war. No armed resistance. The people of Kasara IV were farmers, teachers, doctors. And you executed them as a message. Nethros sighed, the performance of a man bored with petty grievances. You speak of individuals, but the empire deals in systems, ambassador. The colony defied imperial law. Defiance has consequences. A flicker of outrage crossed Carter's face, but he buried it beneath a mask of cold professionalism. You speak as if the right to slaughter civilians is yours by decree. It is not. He turned, addressing the entire chamber now. The Empire wants you to believe this is an isolated event. That it is humanity's burden alone. But tell me, how many of you have suffered under their rule? How many of your worlds have burned while this council turned away? Silence. Eyes shifted. Some species lowered their gaze. Others, those whose own histories bore the scars of imperial conquest, stiffened, their bodies coiling with unspoken resentment. Carter seized the moment. This is not just about humanity. This is about power unchecked, violence without consequence. If we let this pass, then we are all complicit. Nethros chuckled, the sound like grinding stone. And what do you propose, ambassador? War? He gestured lazily. Humanity is weak. Your fleets are an afterthought. Your armies would crumble before our might. Do you intend to lecture us into submission? A few delegates chuckled nervously, but Carter did not flinch. Instead he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. No, he said. I propose justice. The chamber stilled. Even Nethros's expression flickered, just for a second, into something resembling curiosity. Carter took a step forward. The Empire broadcast its massacre to the galaxy, believing it would inspire fear. But fear can turn. His voice hardened. That same broadcast now lives in every network, every archive, on every neutral world. The people have seen it. And they are asking why this council remains silent. A low murmur began to build. Nethros's expression darkened. He knew what Carter was doing, shifting the narrative, weaponizing the very propaganda the Empire had unleashed. The massacre was no longer an instrument of terror, it was a rallying cry. You believe power is measured in fleets and armies, Carter continued. But power is also the will of the governed. Your empire thrives because those beneath you believe resistance is futile. What happens when they start to doubt? When they begin to question? He let the words settle before delivering the final blow. You may kill thousands more, Chancellor, but an idea cannot be executed. The silence that followed was different now. It was not passive, not the silence of submission. It was charged, bristling with something that had long remained dormant in this chamber, possibility. Nethros's fingers curled slightly, the first visible crack in his composure. "You overestimate your influence, Carter." His voice was quieter now but edged with something dangerous. "The Empire does not answer to you. The Empire does not answer to anyone." Carter met his gaze without blinking. "Then let's put that to the test." He turned and walked away, his steps echoing in the chamber. He had done what he came to do. The game had begun. And now the Empire would have to play. The first cracks in the Empire's facade were small, barely noticeable. A hesitation in trade routes that had once flowed without question. A flicker of doubt in the eyes of planetary governors who had ruled under the illusion of absolute control. But cracks, once formed, had a way of spreading. Elias Carter watched it unfold from his office on the orbital station above Earth, the holofeeds flooding in from across the galaxy. The massacre on Cassara 4 had been intended to break humanity, to remind them of their place. Instead, it had become something else, an ember catching dry fields, setting fire to the silence that had long shrouded the Empire's crimes. The images were everywhere now. Not just in human space but across neutral worlds, even in the heart of the Empire itself. Carter had ensured it. Every pirate network, every backdoor relay, every hidden transmission beam carried the footage across borders that the Empire could not control. The moment a sensor shut it down in one sector, it reappeared in another. The atrocity, once meant to instill fear, now fed something the Empire had never intended: outrage. Reports flooded in. Protests in the marketplaces of the Avarax Confederacy. Trade disruptions in the Lakari systems, where workers refused to load Imperial supply ships. Even within the Empire's own territories, whispers of dissent spread like sickness through the lower ranks. Carter turned as the door hissed open. Commander Celine Voss stepped inside, her uniform crisp, her expression unreadable. A former intelligence officer, she had spent years operating in the shadows, gathering the kind of knowledge that could topple governments. She had once told Carter that wars weren't won on battlefields, they were won in whispers, in secrets, in the slow erosion of certainty. "We're in position," she said, dropping a data slate onto his desk. "Our people have infiltrated 3 of the Empire's primary communication relays. The next phase is ready." Carter picked up the slate, scanning the information. "They'll realize it soon," he murmured. "They'll know we're behind this." Voss smirked. "They already do. But they can't stop it. Not without showing weakness." And weakness, Carter knew, was the one thing the Empire could never afford to display. The first true blow came 3 days later. A high-ranking Imperial official, Governor Rendak of the Outer Sectors, defected. Not quietly, not through hidden back channels, but on a public broadcast, live from the Corward capital of Taraxis Prime. "I will not be party to genocide," he declared, his voice ringing through holofeeds across the Empire. His face, lined with the exhaustion of a man who had spent years justifying his government's atrocities, was pale but resolute. "We were told humanity was weak, that they were insignificant, that their suffering did not matter. I have seen the truth, and I will no longer be silent." The impact was immediate. Other officials, fearing the tides of history, began hedging their loyalties. Some resigned. Others simply disappeared. The Empire, for all its might, had never faced an enemy like this. An enemy it could not see, could not crush with fleets or soldiers. Carter sat in the command center, watching the chaos unfold. Across the room, Voss leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "They'll have to respond soon," she said. "They can't let this spiral." He nodded. "They'll escalate. It's their nature." And escalate they did. The Empire struck back with brutal efficiency, deploying security forces to crush protests on occupied worlds, tightening its grip on trade routes, hunting down suspected dissidents. But the more they squeezed, the more resistance they provoked. Their response only fed the flames. Then came the moment Carter had been waiting for. A message, encrypted and buried within a routine supply transmission, found its way to his desk. A single sentence, unsigned, sent from deep within Imperial space. "We need to talk." It was what he had been hoping for, the first sign that cracks had reached the Empire's core. Someone on the inside was ready to turn. Voss read over his shoulder, exhaling sharply. "This could be a trap. Or it could be the beginning of the end," Carter said. Outside the station's viewport, Earth hung in the void, small yet defiant. A world that had once been powerless in the face of greater empires, now standing on the precipice of something greater. The game had changed. The Empire had drawn first blood. But humanity had learned how to fight back. The Imperial High Court had never been forced to convene under such circumstances. The chamber, a towering construct of polished obsidian and shimmering starlight, had always been a place where the Empire's will was enforced, not questioned. It was here that planetary governors were crowned, war decrees were signed, and lesser species were made to kneel. But today, for the first time in its history, the accused was not a nameless dissident or a conquered world's leader. Today the Empire itself stood trial. Grand Marshal Varen was bound in chains of gravimetric steel, a security measure reserved for beings capable of planetary-scale destruction. He did not struggle. His posture remained upright, his face carved from stone, his golden eyes burning with something between defiance and disbelief. He had never imagined this moment. None of them had. Elias Carter stood across from him, not as a diplomat today, but as the man who had made this reckoning possible. His suit was immaculate, his expression unreadable, but the weight in his gaze was impossible to ignore. Chancellor Nethros presided over the trial, his expression carefully composed, but Carter could see the tension in the way his fingers drummed lightly against the armrest of his high-backed chair. The Chancellor was not here by choice. The weight of galactic scrutiny had forced his hand. The Empire had tried to silence the outrage, to crush the fires of rebellion before they could spread. But the momentum had become unstoppable. The Kasara massacre had turned the galaxy against them in a way no fleet or army could undo. Carter stepped forward, his voice steady, carrying through the chamber. Grand Marshal Varen, you stand accused of crimes against sentient life. The massacre of 50,000 unarmed civilians. An act of terror, broadcast as a message of dominance. He let the words settle, his eyes scanning the gathered delegates from across the galaxy. We have seen that message. We have heard it. And today we answer. Varen lifted his chin. I did what was necessary. His voice, deep and unwavering, echoed across the room. You call it a crime. I call it order. A murmur rippled through the chamber, disgust from some, agreement from others. There were still those who believed in the Empire's supremacy, who saw strength as the only law that mattered. But Carter was not here to change their minds. He was here to set a precedent. You call it order, he repeated, his tone sharp. But the foundation of your empire is fear. And fear is failing you. Varen smirked, as if Carter were a child trying to lecture a warlord. Fear is what keeps the galaxy in line, Ambassador. And when the next rebellion rises, when the next colony defies imperial law, what do you think will happen? You can try me, you can even execute me, but the Empire will endure. It always has. Carter held his gaze. Not this time. He turned, addressing the assembled delegates. The Empire has ruled through brutality for centuries. It has raised worlds, enslaved populations, crushed resistance before it could take root. But now the galaxy has seen their crimes in the cold light of truth. He gestured toward Varen. And this man, the one who gave the order, sits in chains before you. Silence. A long heavy pause. Then Nethros exhaled, leaning forward. The High Court recognizes that the acts committed on Kasara 4 were excessive, he said, each word carefully measured. The Empire has agreed to reparations. Carter knew the game Nethros was playing. The Chancellor wanted to contain the damage, to paint this as the action of a single rogue officer rather than the Empire itself. But it was too late for that. No, Carter said simply. Nethros's eyes narrowed. You are in no position to dictate terms, Ambassador. Carter stepped closer. Neither are you. His voice was calm, but the steel in it was undeniable. The Empire's economy is fracturing. Trade partners are severing ties. Your own people are beginning to doubt. The foundation of your power is eroding, Chancellor. You will not sweep this away with a handful of reparations. For the first time, Nethros hesitated. He knew it was true. The execution of Varen was inevitable. He was a liability now, a scapegoat the Empire could afford to lose. But Carter wanted more than a single man's head on a spike. The Empire must answer for more than just one atrocity, Carter continued. You will dismantle the occupation forces on human colonies. You will release political prisoners. And you will acknowledge, formally before this council, that the massacre of Kasara 4 was not just a failure of one man, but of the system that allowed it. A sharp intake of breath. Some delegates whispered. Others watched in stunned silence. This was not just a demand for justice. It was a demand for a shift in power itself. Nethros's jaw tightened. You ask for too much. Carter met his gaze without flinching. I ask for what is necessary. The moment stretched. Varen, still silent, watched with an expression that was almost amused. He had fought wars, crushed rebellions, burned cities to the ground. But he had never fought a battle like this, One waged not with weapons but with words, with the shifting tides of history itself. Finally Nethros exhaled. He looked past Carter, past the courtroom as if calculating every possible future. Then with deliberate precision he nodded once. The Empire will comply. The words sent a ripple through the room, an invisible shift in the galaxy's balance. The Empire had been forced to yield. Carter did not smile. There was no victory to be celebrated and justice long overdue. But as he turned to leave, as the final ruling was read, as Varen's fate was sealed, he allowed himself one quiet thought. The Empire had drawn first blood. But humanity had changed the game.